Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine waking up on a freezing winter morning, right?
Yeah.
And you discover that your own beard has literally frozen solid to the brick that you're using as a pillow.
Oh, man. That's just a brutal image.
It really is. And, you haven't slept in a real bed in like 3 months. You're starving, your body is failing, and the city around you offers absolutely nothing but another drink to just numb the cold.
Yeah, which was the grim, totally unforgiving reality for men in the slums of 19th century Philadelphia.
Exactly. And today, we aren't just looking at history. We are embarking on a deep dive into monitoring the moving of God, a history of America's Keswick. And we're really going to track this sprawling chain of miracles.
Right, because we're tracing how one man's devastating, near-fatal battle with addiction in the late 1800s set off this massive chain reaction.
Yeah, a reaction that built urban rescue missions, forged a pioneering recovery colony in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and then in this astonishing historical twist, eventually funded global linguistics in the jungles of Latin America.
It is a staggering trajectory, honestly. I mean, history often tempts us to just, memorize dates on a timeline or glance at black and white photos of old buildings. But the analytical framework we really need to adopt today is viewing history as a living ecosystem. We're going to examine the evolution of a social and spiritual safety net.
Right, like looking at the mechanics of how these institutional models of care actually adapt over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How do you take a methodology born in the gritty, desperate urban centers of the 19th century, transplant it to the isolated wilderness, and then, watch it mobilize resources to preserve indigenous languages across the globe?
Yeah.
It requires us to look at the how and the why, not just the what.
I really want to look closely at that how, because to me it perfectly illustrates the butterfly effect.
Oh, absolutely.
You have this single quiet conversation in a grimy, dimly lit urban mission, and decades later, the reverberations of that exact conversation literally alter the course of global linguistics.
Yeah.
It's a mind-bending causal chain.
It really is.
But, to comprehend the institutions that were built to save people, we have to start with the architect himself. Before William Ross was constructing rescue missions, he desperately needed saving from his own private hell.
Yeah, and his origin story is it's unapologetically bleak. And we really have to linger there for a minute because you cannot separate the eventual methodology of the institutions he built from the personal devastation he barely survived.
Right.
The source material is unflinching about his condition. I mean, William Ross was an artist by trade, but his life was entirely dictated by severe alcoholism, what the text refers to as the demon of drink.
And the compounding tragedies in his life are, they're difficult to even read about. There's this one specific detail in the text that carries this immense, just suffocating emotional weight.
Yeah, the incident with his child.
Yeah. So he had a sick 3-year-old child.
Yeah.
And one night, coming home from his club, heavily intoxicated, he decides to carry his child up the stairs to bed.
Which is just a recipe for disaster.
It is. He loses his footing, falls full length upon the child on the stairs, and the child dies a few days later.
Wow.
Yeah. Ross wrote later about standing there watching that beautiful white ermine silver-mounted casket lowered into the grave. He acknowledged that he loved his child with all his heart, but the physical and psychological possession of the alcohol simply overrode his humanity.
And, the psychological burden of that specific guilt, knowing your own lack of control resulted in the loss of your child, that's something that destroys most people entirely.
I can't even imagine.
Right. And what we see from Ross next is a classic, desperate, and ultimately totally flawed response to addiction. His family, who were living in England at the time, intervened.
Oh, they sent him away, right?
Exactly. They essentially induced him to leave the country. They sent him across the Atlantic to the United States to live with his uncle and cousins. The prevailing logic was that a complete change of scenery, severing ties with his old drinking associates, would somehow cure the underlying condition.
It's what we call the geographic cure, right?
Yeah.
But it's a complete illusion.
It is a profound illusion, yeah. And it's a psychological concept we really need to dissect because modern addiction recovery still wrestles with this exact misconception today.
Oh, for sure.
The geographic cure is the fallacy that Altering your external location will somehow rewrite your internal struggles. It's the belief that your physical environment is the sole root of your problem, rather than, your internal coping mechanisms, unresolved trauma, or physiological dependencies.
So it's the thought process of, like, if I just move to a new city, get a fresh start, or leave this toxic friend group, I'll stop drinking, or I'll stop making terrible financial choices.
Exactly.
I think we all do this on some level, even outside of addiction. Like, we change jobs hoping to cure our burnout, only to realize we brought our own workaholic tendencies to the new desk.
That is the perfect modern parallel. Wherever you go, there you are. You pack your trauma, your habits, and your neurochemistry in your suitcase right alongside your clothes.
Yeah, you can't outrun yourself.
Right. So William Ross moved across an ocean, and he simply resumed the exact same destructive behaviors in the U.S. that he exhibited in England.
It's just so tragic.
He later noted in his writings that the root problem was internal, but he had to lose literally everything else in his life before that realization finally took hold.
And when we say he lost everything, the tragedy just escalates. Because he doesn't just struggle alone in America. He marries, and in a devastating turn, he discovers that his new bride had also been secretly drinking.
Yeah, that was a massive blow.
They end up locked in this shared misery, essentially enabling one another. The text mentions they never missed a morning where the servant would bring milk and Jamaica rum directly to their bedroom door. It became the axis their entire world spun on.
They systematically dismantled their own lives. They lost money in bank failures. They mortgaged properties, spent that money, sold the properties, and drank the proceeds.
Just a complete downward spiral.
He documented that they went through 14 different houses. It was a slow motion collapse of their entire socioeconomic foundation,
which culminates in the ultimate isolating tragedy. After receiving word that his devout mother had passed away in England, Ross spirals even deeper.
And then his wife passes, right?
Yes. His wife, maintaining her own heavy drinking, reclines on a sofa one afternoon while their young boys are playing on the floor nearby.
Yeah.
The boys assume she's just taking a nap, but she never wakes up. She dies right there on the sofa.
That moment strips away every remaining layer of support and every illusion of control Ross had left. He is left utterly isolated, staring into the abyss of his own making.
That isolation brings us to the year 1886. He hits absolute foundational rock bottom. He's penniless, his physical health is failing rapidly, and he is confined to a room he can barely afford. He staggers in one day, falls against an armchair, and just cries out to God in sheer desperation. He explicitly states, "I was on the verge of delirium tremens, but peace came at last." Let's pause there, because I think a lot of people hear the phrase delirium tremens and just assume it means a bad hangover.
Yeah.
What is he actually experiencing physically in that room?
Yeah, delirium tremens, or the DTs, is the most severe form of ethanol withdrawal. When someone with profound chronic alcoholism suddenly stops or reduces their intake, their central nervous system, which has been artificially depressed for years, essentially goes into hyperdrive.
Wow, so it's a physiological overload.
Exactly. We are talking about intense body tremors, profound confusion, terrifying visual and auditory hallucinations, and massive spikes in heart rate and blood pressure. It can induce seizures and is frequently fatal if untreated.
That is terrifying.
So when Ross says he was on the verge of delirium tremens, he isn't speaking metaphorically. His body is biologically shutting down and misfiring simultaneously.
The stakes are literally life and death. But he cries out, and the text describes this incredible, near-instant deliverance. He experiences a total release from alcohol, from his gambling habits, and from profanity.
Right.
But I want to push on something that really caught my attention in the source material. It highlights this miraculous, sudden deliverance from booze and gambling. But then it spends a surprising amount of time detailing his agonizing, ongoing struggle with tobacco. If you are writing a history book to make your founder look good, why leave that in?
It's a fascinating editorial choice by the historians, honestly, and I believe it's included because it violently grounds the narrative in reality.
Right.
So often, institutional histories sanitize their founders. They turn them into flawless, glowing saints who never struggle again. By dedicating space to his battle with tobacco, it demonstrates that recovery and sanctification is usually a brutal, grinding process, not a single lightning bolt moment.
That makes a lot of sense.
It proves that spiritual awakening doesn't automatically erase physiological reality.
Yeah. And the details of the tobacco struggle are so vivid, it paints a picture of intense physical addiction. He kept his pipe filled by his bedside, ready to strike a match the exact second he woke up.
Yeah, that's intense.
He couldn't even put the pipe down to shave his own face. He would just push the pipe to the opposite side of his mouth while shaving one cheek and then switch it over. That is a level of nicotine dependence that dictates your every movement.
It really highlights how deeply the physiological hook of nicotine was embedded, even after the psychological reliance on alcohol to numb his grief had been broken. He had a spiritual awakening, but his neural pathways were still screaming for nicotine.
Yeah, and he wrestles with it for about 6 months. The turning point happens when he's attending a neighborhood church meeting. He feels this immense conviction about the tobacco, and he actually tries to run away.
He literally leaves the building, right?
He leaves the building and tries to argue with God out on the sidewalk. But he finally yields, goes back inside, falls to his knees, and prays, "Lord, you delivered me from the curse of drink. Will you also set me free from tobacco?" And from that specific day forward, the physical craving is gone.
Which establishes a secondary but absolutely vital foundational lesson for him. The absolute necessity of total surrender. He learns that partial compliance doesn't yield freedom.
Exactly.
And this newfound complete liberation gives him a terrifying sense of power in his witness. He is now entirely equipped for the pivot that defines the rest of his life.
That pivot happens in 1887. He marries Dora Reed, a minister's daughter who completely shares his burden for marginalized people. And once Roz achieves this personal victory, his immediate impulse isn't to run away to the suburbs and hide.
No, not at all.
He turns right back around and walks straight into the exact environment that almost killed him. The Tenderloin District of Philadelphia, the Center City slums.
It's an incredibly bold move. He begins going to established rescue missions, specifically the Sunday Breakfast Association, and giving his testimony to massive gatherings of transient men right off the street.
Which is so powerful.
And if we analyze the sociology of peer-led recovery, the power dynamic here is incredible. The men listening to him aren't being lectured by a wealthy, detached theologian who has never tasted liquor.
Right, they're looking at one of their own.
Exactly. They are looking at a man who just months prior was as filthy and destitute as they are. The text notes their exact logical reasoning. Well, if he could do it for a fellow like that, he can do it for me.
He has the ultimate street credibility. But he didn't just stand on a stage and preach. There is one specific encounter detailed in the sources that reads like a tense scene in a movie, and it really showcases his methodology.
The altar call incident.
Exactly. So Roz is sitting on the platform one night, looking out over this sea of desperate faces, and he spots one specific man. The source text describes the man's face as almost frightening in its grim and grimy expression. When the invitation is given to come forward for prayer, this man refuses to move. So Roz doesn't wait. He steps off the platform, walks down the aisle, and literally climbs over rows of chairs just to sit in an unoccupied seat next to this intimidating figure.
And the moment he sits down, Roz is hit with a stench that the text describes as nauseating.
But Roz doesn't flinch. He doesn't hold his breath or lean away. He slips his arm right over the man's filthy shoulders and says in a very soft voice, "Friend, God loves you and wants to give you a new life."
And the man physically snarls at him.
Yeah, snapping back, "Nobody loves me, and certainly not God."
Let's dissect Roz's methodology in that exact moment. This marks a critical transition from mere evangelism to tactile, holistic social work. He didn't shout a scripture verse from the safety of the elevated stage.
Right.
He invaded the man's physical space with an act of radical, unflinching acceptance. He ignored the biological repulsiveness of the smell. He offered physical touch and arm around the shoulder to a man who was almost certainly used to people either actively avoiding him or physically striking him.
I kept thinking about it like a modern-day crisis negotiator. You know?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like you can't negotiate from a megaphone outside the building. You have to step off the safety of your platform and go sit right in the blast radius of someone's trauma if you actually want to reach them. Roz stepped into the blast radius.
Sitting in the blast radius is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Because when this hardened man finally softens under that radical acceptance, the sheer scale of the trauma he reveals is staggering.
The backstory is wild. The man explains to Roz that he had arrived in Philadelphia just hours earlier, riding illegally on a freight train from the far west. And the reason he was running, he had just escaped from a gang of bandits led by none other than the notorious Jesse James.
It abruptly places this narrative squarely in the chaotic, violent reality of late 19th century America. We aren't just talking about urban poverty. We are intersecting with outlaw history.
Yeah, the man explains he had run away from his Christian parents after a bitter dispute, and out west, he became easy prey. The Jesse James gang forced him to join.
Forced him into violent crime.
Exactly. They held him in constant fear for his life, forced him to participate in armed robberies. And this part shows the absolute psychological darkness he was subjected to. He reveals that their preparation for raids involved bizarre rituals of Satan worship, animal sacrifice, and gross immorality.
If we extrapolate on the physiological state of that man sitting in the chair next to Roz, consider the sheer nervous system overload he is enduring.
Oh, absolutely.
He's a traumatized runaway, systematically coerced into violent crime and psychological terror. He has been fleeing across the country on open freight cars, starving, filthy, sleep-deprived, and entirely convinced he has crossed a moral event horizon from which he cannot return.
Yeah, he thinks he's too far gone.
Right. Roz wasn't just dealing with a guy who drank too much. He was interfacing with profound, complex PTSD and severe physical neglect.
Roz manages to lead this man to faith, right there, which is a miracle in itself. But here's the crucial part. Roz doesn't stop with a prayer. He finds out the man's father is a minister out west, but the son is far too ashamed to go back and disgrace his family further.
Right.
Roz refuses to let it go. He gets on the telephone, and remember, coordinating a long-distance phone call in the late 1880s was a massive, expensive logistical undertaking, and he calls the father.
And the father immediately responds that they have been praying constantly for his return.
Roz puts the kid on the phone. They have this incredible, tearful reunion. But again, Roz takes it a step further into the practical. He gets the guy physically strengthened over a few days, gets him entirely clean clothes, and then buys him a ticketed seat on a passenger train to go home. He ensures the man never has to ride in a freezing freight car again.
That final detail is the linchpin, restoring dignity. Roz didn't just offer spiritual platitudes, pat him on the back, and send him back out to the dangerous rail yards.
Yeah, that would have been so easy to do.
He utilized actual financial resources to ensure physical safety and familial restoration. This holistic approach, combining the spiritual intervention with immediate, practical, dignified care, becomes the permanent DNA of everything Roz builds from that point on.
Which perfectly transitions us into his next massive undertaking, the Whosoever Gospel Mission and the industrial concept. Because Roz is having such profound success in the center city, he gets this burning desire to start a similar work in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. He's seeing a specific demographic. Men whose lives have been destroyed by alcohol, who have lost their jobs and their homes, and he wants to create a dedicated, permanent space for them.
And the real estate he chooses for this new endeavor is rich with historical irony.
It's incredible. In 1892, he buys an old, rundown building at 5606 Germantown Avenue. And it just so happens to be the exact same building that used to house the saloon, where Roz himself did the vast majority of his drinking before he got sober.
It is the ultimate architectural reclamation project. He is physically reclaiming the exact real estate of his previous destruction and turning it into a sanctuary.
Yeah.
But there is a very specific architectural decision he makes when converting the saloon into a gospel hall that I find sociologically brilliant.
He leaves the swinging saloon doors completely intact at the entrance.
Yes. From an environmental psychology perspective, that is a stroke of genius. Think about the target demographic.
Right.
If you take an old building and erect a pristine, imposing church facade with heavy oak doors and stained glass, you immediately raise the barrier to entry for a marginalized, impoverished man. He walks by, looks at the building, and feels underdressed, unworthy, and deeply intimidated. He won't go in.
That makes total sense.
But a swinging saloon door, that triggers muscle memory. That represents an environment where he inherently feels at ease, where he knows how to operate. Roz intentionally lowered the threshold of anxiety to simply get them in the room.
It's the physical embodiment of meeting people exactly where they are. And it was wildly successful. The place grew so fast they quickly had to expand operations to provide transitional housing, creating what they called the rescue home and shelter.
Yeah.
And this is where a fascinating new character enters the story. John R. McIntyre.
McIntyre's story parallels Roz in many functional ways, but his starting point was from an even higher socioeconomic peak.
Right. McIntyre wasn't an artist. He was an Englishman who came from serious generational wealth. He recounted having a dozen servants at his disposal at one time, managing various large properties.
Wow.
But alcohol became his master. His family, just like Roz's family, attempted the geographic cure. They shipped him off to America, hoping the new environment would fix his drinking. And it actually worked for a little while.
He got a job, didn't he?
He did. He leveraged his skills to get a high-level executive position at the massive John Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. But eventually, the internal demons caught up. He started drinking heavily again, lost his executive job, burned through his resources, and drifted completely into absolute street homelessness.
It really highlights the great leveler of addiction. The pathology doesn't respect wealth, education, or social status.
The source material provides this brutal, haunting image of McIntyre wandering the streets of Philadelphia, sleeping in dark alleys for months on end. He recalled waking up on freezing winter mornings to find his beard literally frozen to the brick he was using as a pillow.
It is an unimaginable level of physical suffering and degradation for a man who used to employ a dozen servants.
Finally, desperate, having not slept in a bed for 3 entire months, his weakened, freezing body somehow makes the 6-mile trek from Center City out to Germantown to seek out Roz.
A literal journey for survival.
Yeah, he staggers through those swinging saloon doors. Roz receives him with open arms. They get on their knees right there in that old converted bar room, and McIntyre finds deliverance. And from that moment, McIntyre and Roz become an unstoppable team.
And together, they develop and perfect what becomes known as the industrial mission concept.
Let's unpack this industrial mission model, because it is crucial to understanding their philosophy. It wasn't just a soup kitchen handing out free meals. They based their entire operational model on a verse from 2 Thessalonians 3.10, the idea that a man should not eat if you were unwilling to work.
Right.
So even the most transient men seeking shelter had to work a designated number of hours to earn their bed and their meals. They chopped wood, they manufactured brooms, they repaired shoes, they reclined chairs. I want to push back on this a little bit, though. By modern standards, is this just harsh, tough love? Are they really refusing to feed starving guys unless they do manual labor? Or is there something deeper, something psychologically necessary happening here regarding the rebuilding of a person's dignity?
That is the essential question about the nature of charity versus rehabilitation. If we look at the historical context of the 1890s, a pure handout model, just giving someone a meal and sending them away, often reinforced a cycle of sheer dependency.
Right.
The industrial mission model, far from being cruel, was highly progressive and deeply therapeutic for its time. By requiring labor chopping wood, making a physical broom, they were teaching men the value of industry. But more importantly, they were demonstrating to these men that they still possessed utility. They could still create value in the world.
So earning your keep fundamentally feels different than begging for it.
Exactly. It restores a sense of agency. Let's look at the brain mechanics here. When you are chronically homeless and addicted, your executive function, the part of the brain responsible for planning, initiating tasks, and foreseeing consequences, is essentially hijacked.
Yeah.
You feel entirely powerless, a victim of circumstance and your own immediate cravings. By giving a man a defined, achievable task and directly rewarding the completion of that task with a warm bed and a hot meal, you are reestablishing the fundamental cause and effect loop of a healthy life. You are rebuilding their executive function and their self-worth concurrently with their spiritual rehabilitation.
That makes total sense. They're rebuilding the man, not just feeding him. And McIntyre and Roz were tireless in this effort. They weren't just running the shelter, they were out on the streets. They founded the 1st and 2nd 8th Street missions. And they initiated these massive events called midnight theater services at the Bijou Theater.
Which was a fascinating, highly unorthodox evangelistic strategy for the era.
They would rent out the Bijou Theater at 9:30 every Sunday night. Think about the timing. All the regular, respectable morning churches had long since closed their doors, and the last secular theatrical performance of the evening had just ended.
Right, capturing a totally different crowd.
Christian workers would fan out into the slums, into the alleys and saloons, and invite people in. And they were packing this theater with 1,200 to 1,500 people every single week.
They were actively utilizing secular cultural infrastructure for spiritual purposes. They captured an audience that would never, under any circumstances, set foot in a traditional Sunday morning church service.
Exactly.
But here is where the narrative shifts. Because despite all this massive numerical success, despite packing theaters and running industrial homes, Roz begins to identify a critical systemic flaw in their urban model.
Yeah, the success actually created a new problem. Roz is looking at all these men making professions of faith, getting sober in the mission, working in the broom shop. But then he observes a heartbreaking pattern.
The relapse rate.
Yes. A man gets saved, he gets cleaned up, he walks out the front door of the mission to go find a job. And what is staring him in the face? 50 active saloons. The geography is actively working against them.
The source text specifically notes that for the recovering drunkard, Temptations were everywhere present. These men were immature in their new life, their coping mechanisms were still fragile, and they simply couldn't withstand the constant, aggressive bombardment of their environment.
It makes me think of an analogy. Trying to treat severe addiction in the middle of a 19th century urban slum is like trying to dry yourself off with a towel while you are still standing inside a running shower.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You can rub with a towel all you want. You can have the best towel in the world. But as long as you are standing under the water, you are constantly getting hit with new moisture. You have to physically step out of the shower environment to actually dry off.
A perfect visceral metaphor. The urban environment was actively, aggressively undermining their rehabilitation. Roz realized that physical separation wasn't just a luxury, it was a clinical necessity.
So he starts searching for a solution. He's praying, he's reading widely, and he comes across a book called The Colony of Mercy by an author named Julie Sutter. The book details a ministry in Germany called Bethel, founded by a pastor, von Bogelschwing. And this Bethel model took marginalized people, what they call the outcasts of society, and placed them in a friendly, highly productive rural environment where they could work the land together.
This represents a massive paradigm shift in American social care. We are witnessing the evolution from the urban rescue model, which pulls a man out of the river but leaves him on the muddy bank, to the rural therapeutic community model.
Yeah.
This is essentially an early faith-based blueprint for the modern long-term inpatient rehab facility. The underlying theory was that the physical environment itself, the quiet of nature, the rhythm of agricultural work, the clean air, and the sheer geographical distance from triggers was a vital, active therapeutic tool in the healing process.
Roz articulated this need beautifully. He wrote, "Want of elbow room is the mother of half our wickedness. What is wanted is more light, more air. Aye, elbow room to live decent lives. There is land enough and to spare." He just needed to find that land.
And the manner in which he procures that land ties directly back to our analytical framework of a chain of miracles.
It really does. Roz is riding on a funeral train one day, and he overhears a casual conversation from a man sitting near him. The man mentions that there is a large tract of property for sale out in New Jersey.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Seriously. So Roz travels out to investigate. He finds Giberson's Mill in Whiting, New Jersey. It's a 400-acre tract of land deep in the Pine Barrens. It has an old farmhouse, a bunkhouse, a barn, a water-powered sawmill, a beautiful lake, and crucially, the absolute most important feature of the entire property.
It was located exactly 6 miles away from the nearest saloon.
6 miles of dense, unforgiving pine forest between these vulnerable men and their addiction. That is the ultimate definition of elbow room. But to make this massive leap, to abandon the successful city work, he needs his wife's buy-in. Dora is out in California attending a convention at the time. Roz sends her a telegram asking if she is willing to leave the security, the funding, and the established success of their mission in Philadelphia to go pioneer this totally unknown, rugged, rural project in the woods of New Jersey.
Her response via telegram is incredibly poignant, and it speaks volumes about their shared, unshakable vision.
She replies with a single Bible reference,
Yeah.
Ruth 1.16, which reads, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God."
Complete unconditional solidarity. And with that, in 1897, the Keswick Colony of Mercy is officially founded.
And they didn't just hire contractors to build it. They built it from the ground up with their own hands. Those recovering men from the city missions came out to the woods. They utilized that old water-powered sawmill to cut timber straight from their 400 acres. And here's a detail I love. They actually found a huge abandoned Victorian structure called the Magnolia Hotel in Toms River. They carefully dismantled it, numbered all the individual parts, shipped it to Keswick by railroad, and meticulously rebuilt it on the shores of their lake. That resurrected hotel became their main administration and guest building, known as the Barasha Building.
It's the Germantown industrial mission concept scaled up to massive architecture. The men weren't just making brooms anymore. They were actively constructing the very sanctuary of their own healing.
Wow. Yeah.
Think about what that does to a man's pride and self-worth. To tear down a derelict building, move it, and rebuild it into a place of refuge. The psychological ownership that process creates in a person in recovery is profound. They literally built their own safe haven.
It's a beautiful image. But as we move forward into the early 20th century, we see that institutions can never just rest on their laurels. An institution either adapts to historical shifts or it dies.
And a massive historical and cultural shift was rapidly approaching.
First, there's a painful personal shift. William Rawes, the visionary founder who started it all, passes away in 1910. The immense weight of the vision is passed down to his wife, Dora, and his son, Addison.
Right.
And Addison had his own powerful testimony of transformation. He didn't struggle with alcohol like his father, but he struggled with a vicious, uncontrollable temper. It was so severe that in one terrifying fit of anger, he actually physically struck his own mother.
The source text carefully notes it was fortunately a glancing blow, or he could have harmed her severely.
The horror of that moment broke him. He was heartbroken, entirely repentant, threw himself on the Lord, and experienced a complete deliverance from that blinding anger. So Addison implicitly understood the core DNA of Keswick, the reality of victory over dominating destructive sins.
Yeah, he got it.
But he was about to face a challenge his father never anticipated. In 1920, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution goes into effect. The era of prohibition begins.
This is a critical juncture for the institution. As we analyze this, we must view prohibition objectively, strictly as a macro-historical force. Leading up to 1920, there was a massive growing national conscience regarding the destructive nature of alcohol abuse, spearheaded by highly organized groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League.
Okay, right.
These were formidable social movements that successfully lobbied to legally regulate and eventually outright ban the manufacture and distribution of alcoholic beverages.
And just to be clear for you listening, we aren't taking a political side on the legislation itself, but we have to look closely at the practical impact it had on the ground. For a place like Keswick, whose entire operational model and primary demographic consisted of men whose lives had been destroyed by public drunkenness, prohibition initially did exactly what its proponents designed it to do.
It drastically, almost immediately decreased the number of applicants to the Colony of Mercy. If the corner saloons are forcibly closed, the immediate visible wreckage of alcoholism in the streets diminishes, at least temporarily.
Exactly. The source material notes that during the earlier years, the law seemed highly effective. But it also frankly notes the eventual spectacular failure of the experiment, an erosion of public conscience, the rise of dangerous illicit liquor, and the economic boom of the infamous speakeasy.
Right.
But in that weird interim period of the 1920s, Keswick was sitting on 400 acres of prime land and these huge, beautiful buildings, and they were severely underutilized. The beds were empty.
This is the exact moment where organizational agility becomes a matter of institutional survival. They could have simply shuttered the windows, declared the problem solved, and waited out the cultural tide. Instead, they pivot their model entirely.
They partner with an organization called the Victorious Life Testimony. Dora and Addison Rawls approach this board and suggest turning the beautiful Keswick property into a year-round conference center for spiritual rest, renewal, and deep biblical teaching.
A huge change.
Yeah, they start hosting these massive summer conferences, teaming up with key theological figures of the day, like Dr. Charles Trumbull, the editor of the highly influential Sunday School Times, and Dr. Robert C. McQuilkin.
And this strategic pivot fundamentally changes the entire financial and cultural ecosystem of Keswick. By bringing in thousands of middle-class guests for these summer conferences, they generated the revenue, the national awareness, and the massive network required to quietly subsidize the Colony of Mercy for the addicted men.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It kept that core mission alive and fully funded, even when their daily numbers were low.
But it wasn't just peaceful Bible studies by the lake. This is the part of the story that absolutely fascinates me. This place, founded by a desperately alcoholic artist to save the most destitute men from the Philadelphia slums, suddenly becomes the epicenter of a high-level academic theological battleground involving elite Princeton theologians.
The doctrinal controversy of Keswick.
Yes. The core teaching at these Victorious Life conferences focused heavily on victorious living, the idea of experiencing God's immediate victory over daily besetting sin. But a very prominent heavyweight theologian from Princeton named B.B. Warfield catches wind of this and writes a scathing public critique.
Yeah, he wasn't happy.
He claims this teaching leans way too close to perfectionism, the theological idea that a Christian can reach a state of living entirely without sin in this life. Let's break that down for a listener who isn't steeped in 19th century church history. Why was Warfield so threatened by this?
To simplify a complex debate, Warfield represented a traditional Reformed view, which posits that the Christian life is a constant grinding struggle against inherent sin until the day you die. You are forgiven, but you will always wrestle.
Right.
The Victorious Life camp, influenced by Wesleyan theology, believed that a believer could tap into a divine power through total surrender to consistently, victoriously overcome specific, known sins in their daily life.
I see the conflict.
Warfield viewed this as dangerous arrogance. He felt it trivialized the depth of human corruption. So Warfield attacking them was a serious threat to the movement's orthodox credibility.
So the Victorious Life leaders are under attack by Princeton. But they don't back down. They appoint their own theological heavyweight, Dr. W.H. Griffith Thomas, to write a formal, exhaustive two-part rebuttal in the prestigious academic journal Bibliotheca Sacra in 1919. Thomas rigorously defends the teaching, argues that Warfield completely misunderstood their connection to Wesleyan theology, and essentially fires back, saying Warfield's theology is great for legally saving a sinner, but it offers absolutely no practical daily help for a believer actually trying to stop drinking or stop a raging temper.
It was a brilliant defense. And how did this intense academic scrutiny change the identity of Keswick? It elevated their platform immensely. It forced them to articulate their experiential beliefs with rigorous academic precision, defending them in the highest theological circles of the country.
Yeah, they had to prove themselves.
It permanently transformed Keswick from a quiet, localized rescue operation in the woods into a nationally recognized intellectual and spiritual hub.
And because it became this massive hub, it began to attract people with incredible, world-changing ambitions. The conferences at Keswick didn't just attract people seeking personal peace and theological debate. They became a lightning rod for global action.
This is where the butterfly effect you mentioned in the introduction truly takes flight. We are moving from local rescue to global impact.
We have to introduce two men who cross paths through the sprawling network of the Victorious Life conferences. First, L.L. Legters. He was a former Dutch Reformed missionary who had been working with Native Americans in Oklahoma.
Right.
But he boldly resigned his position over a massive fundamental dispute with his denominational board. The board wanted the Native Americans to abandon their tribal languages and only learn English. Legters vehemently disagreed. He understood that to truly reach a person's soul, you had to speak to them in their heart language.
Which is a remarkably modern, culturally sensitive, anthropological approach to missions for that era. Most boards viewed indigenous languages as primitive obstacles, not cultural treasures.
And the second man is Cameron Townsend. Townsend and Legters bond over a shared, heavy burden for the completely unreached tribal groups of Latin America. They were part of a dedicated group praying specifically for the indigenous people of Guatemala, known as the Chichicastenango 12.
Townsend had forged this core conviction while out in the field trying to sell Spanish Bibles to indigenous people who simply didn't speak Spanish. He realized the sheer absurdity of it. He believed these tribes desperately needed the Bible translated into their own mother tongue.
Right.
But traditional mission boards of the day were largely ignoring indigenous languages, focusing only on the dominant colonial trade languages.
So Legters and Townsend have this massive, unprecedented vision, but they need an engine. They have no money and no sending agency. They go to the Victorious Life Testimony Council at Keswick. And the council essentially says, look, we aren't a traditional sending agency. We run a conference center and a rehab colony, but we see the critical need.
Yeah.
So in 1921, they create an entirely new entity, the Pioneer Mission Agency. I want to understand the logistics here. How does a colony for recovering alcoholics actually fund an expedition to the Amazon? Walk me through the mechanics of that.
It's a brilliant piece of structural innovation. The Pioneer Mission Agency was set up not to directly manage missionaries on the ground in Latin America, but to act as a powerful administrative and funding hub in the United States.
Okay, I'm tracking.
During the massive summer conferences at Keswick, which drew thousands of attendees, lecturers would present the vision. They would take up offerings, publish the linguistic needs in the Sunday School Times, and gather immense resources. The Keswick board provided the legal and administrative shell to receive those funds and forward them directly to the linguists doing the work.
It's like Keswick became a venture capital firm. But instead of funding tech startups in Silicon Valley, they were using their conference offerings and their massive network to fund highly experimental linguistic breakthroughs in the Amazon basin and the mountains of Mexico.
That is exactly what they functioned as an incubator for linguistic preservation. Legders traveled constantly, raising funds through the Keswick network. And what did that initial venture capital build?
It eventually births Camp Wycliffe. Leggers and Townsend start a rudimentary training camp to teach aspiring missionaries the complex science of linguistics so they can analyze unwritten languages, create alphabets, and translate the Bible.
Amazing.
That little camp grows into the Summer Institute of Linguistics, or SIL. It gets so incredibly large and respected that it has to move its operations to the University of Oklahoma. And eventually, this whole operation spins off and becomes Wycliffe Bible Translators, one of the largest linguistic organizations in human history.
Let's just pause and trace the compounding interest of this history because it is staggering. The preservation of dozens of indigenous Latin American languages in the 20th century, languages that might otherwise have been entirely lost to linguistic imperialism, has a direct, unbroken causal link to a desperate alcoholic artist hitting rock bottom in a cheap room in Philadelphia decades prior.
William Rawes cries out for help, gets sober, builds a colony in the woods to help others. The colony has to host conferences to survive Prohibition. The conferences attract Legders and Townsend. The colony's board uses its offerings to fund their linguistic camp, and boom, an indigenous tribe in Guatemala gets a written alphabet and literature in their own language. The chain of miracles is real.
It perfectly highlights the compounding nature of social and spiritual enterprises. When you build an institution genuinely grounded in human restoration, you have absolutely no idea how far the shockwaves of that restoration will travel across time and geography.
But we also have to recognize that this legacy wasn't just built on theological victories and global expansions. It was severely tested and nearly destroyed by physical devastation.
The fire of 1942.
Yes. March 10, 1942. A date that almost ended the entire Keswick experiment. Addison Rawes, the founder's son, had been away speaking at a church in Paterson, New Jersey. He gets a frantic call early Monday morning, speeds back to Keswick, and arrives to find absolute smoking devastation. The Rawes Memorial Building, the famous Barasha Building, the massive heart of their operations, dining and housing, had burned entirely to the ground.
This is the massive Victorian structure they had painstakingly dismantled, transported from Toms River, and rebuilt by hand decades earlier.
Gone, reduced to ash. Only the brick chimneys were left standing. Addison rushes to a small cottage on the property and finds his family, the operational staff, and as many colony men as could physically fit, all crammed inside, reeling from the shock.
And in the midst of that profound shock, with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, they did something deeply anchoring.
They held their morning devotions. They refused to break their routine. They followed their regular practice of reading from a daily devotional book called Daily Light. And the verses scheduled for that exact tragic day were uncanny. They read from 2 Corinthians about the God of all comfort, and then they looked at the text scheduled for the very next day, Psalm 62.8, God is a refuge for us.
And the reading for the following day was Matthew 6, instructing them not to lay up treasures upon earth where moth and rust corrupt, and where thieves break in, and where implicitly fire consumes.
It anchored them spiritually. But the practical operational reality was incredibly grim. The massive summer conference season was just months away, and remember the year? This was 1942. The United States is fully entrenched in World War II. Building materials are strictly rationed by the government. You can't just go buy steel and lumber.
The resilience of the organization is tested to its absolute limits here. The fire could have, and realistically probably should have, ended them.
But they made the hard decision to rebuild immediately. They brought in an architect, Charles Blatchley, and they designed a new, modern, fire-resistant building using cinder blocks and brick. And remarkably, against all odds, they managed to secure the heavy steel beams they needed for the dining room ceiling despite the severe wartime shortages.
That's incredible.
They worked day and night and had it ready, at least the vital dining room and kitchen parts, just in time for the summer conferences.
This trial by fire forged a deep organizational toughness. They proved they could survive catastrophic loss. And we see the maturity of that toughness play out about a decade later in a totally different kind of crisis. A crisis not of loss, but of overwhelming opportunity.
The Chester Crest experiment in 1953. This is such a brilliant leadership case study. With all their success rebuilding in New Jersey, you have to wonder if anyone tried to copy their model. And actually, Keswick is approached by an older organization that runs the New York Christian Home for Intemperate Men. They have this massive, sprawling, 100-acre, state-of-the-art facility in Katona, New York, called Chester Crest. But they are failing. They are struggling to make it work financially and programmatically.
So they offer it to Keswick. It is essentially a No strings attached gift of prime New York real estate and a massive, fully equipped facility.
It seems like a dream come true. Instant expansion. Keswick takes possession, sends a dedicated team up there, and starts running the program free of charge, implementing their proven industrial work model. But after a period of trial, Addison, Ross, and the board do something exceedingly difficult.
Yeah, they pull the plug.
They look at the operation, realize it is a massive ongoing drain on their manpower and financial resources, and they say, this isn't working for us.
They possess the rare organizational maturity to recognize a poison chalice. It takes immense discipline to reject a massive, prestigious asset. They realized that managing Chester Crest was causing mission drift. It was diluting their focus and resources away from their core mission in New Jersey. So they made the tough call. They sold the New York property at auction and used the proceeds to heavily expand and solidify their primary campus. It demonstrates the profound wisdom of knowing when to say no to a gift.
And that kind of sharp organizational wisdom had to be passed down, which brings up a potential red flag I want to explore with you. We are talking about 3 consecutive generations of the Ross family running this institution.
Yeah.
William, then Addison, and then Addison's son, Bill Ross.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an inherent danger in one family maintaining control of a nonprofit like that? How did they avoid Keswick devolving into a nepotistic monarchy?
It's a very valid critique of many legacy nonprofits. Founder syndrome can absolutely suffocate an institution if leadership is treated as a blood right rather than a stewardship. The way Keswick managed it was through mandatory external educational friction and rigorous bottom-up training.
Right. When Bill Ross grew up, he didn't just get handed the keys to the corner office because his last name was Ross. He was sent away to Wheaton College and then to the prestigious, academically rigorous Dallas Theological Seminary. He was exposed to different leadership models, different theologies, and different ways of doing things outside the Keswick bubble.
And crucially, even when he came back to New Jersey with his advanced academic degrees, his father, Addison, didn't just put him behind an executive desk.
No. The source material explicitly says Addison made him spend months working hands-on with the addicted men in the Colony of Mercy. He had to learn the gritty, unglamorous reality of the work from the ground floor up. He had to earn the respect of the men.
And eventually, decades later, as Bill Ross reached retirement age, he recognized that the era of family leadership needed to conclude for the ultimate health of the organization. He gracefully helped transition the executive leadership to highly capable non-family members like John Bryant and later Bill Welt.
That intentional, egoless transition is the hallmark of a truly healthy organization. When the mission finally outgrows the shadow of the founding family and becomes a self-sustaining entity.
And you really can't talk about Keswick being self-sustaining without mentioning the incredible everyday staff members who kept the wheels turning behind the scenes. The text specifically highlights a couple, Carl and Tutty Faust.
Because the backbone of any enduring institution is rarely the visionary founder alone. It's the dedicated, often deeply eccentric operational staff who execute the vision daily.
Oh, they were definitely unique. Carl was known as the speed walker. The text says he literally did the work of 10 men, and his catchphrase around the sprawling campus was people constantly asking, "Where's Carl?" Because he was moving so fast you couldn't track him down.
I love that.
And his wife, Tutty, I love this detail so much. She was a poet who wrote personalized verses for everyone's birthday, but she had absolutely terrible typing skills. People would get these beautiful, deeply heartfelt poems filled with uncorrected typos, and they just cherish them anyway.
It wonderfully humanizes the history. These aren't just gears in a corporate machine. They're deeply committed individuals pouring their quirks, their energy, and their love into the relentless daily grind of ministry.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we zoom out and look at this entire sweep of history we've covered today, it is truly staggering. We started in a grim 19th century artist's studio with William Ross at the absolute depths of hopeless addiction, mourning the loss of his wife and child. We watched him rise, find deliverance, and plunge his hands into the foulest slums of Philadelphia to pull others out.
Right.
We saw the creation of a massive sanctuary in the Pine Barrens, the survival through the cultural earthquake of Prohibition, and the eventual miraculous funding of global linguistic preservation.
It's a testament to the compounding nature of restoration. And as we conclude, I would challenge you, the listener, to consider the principles at play here in your own modern life or profession. Think about the swinging doors of that Germantown mission. In whatever work you do, how can you intentionally lower the barriers to entry for people who are marginalized or intimidated? How can you meet them in a space that feels familiar and safe?
That is a challenge we can all take to heart.
And furthermore, think about the vital concept of elbow room. In our hyper-connected, constantly stimulated modern world, where are you cultivating your own elbow room? Where is your physical and mental separation from the noise, the digital triggers, and the exhaustion, so that genuine healing and clarity can take root?
Creating space to breathe. I love that. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, a paradox that has been bouncing around my head as we discussed all this. But think back to the very beginning of the story. William Raw's family initially tried to cure his severe alcoholism by moving him from England across the ocean to America. It was the classic geographic cure, and it completely, spectacularly failed him. He brought his demons right along with him in his suitcase.
Yeah, true.
Yet, decades later, Raw's built his greatest legacy, the Keswick Colony of Mercy, on the exact opposite premise that physically moving addicted men out of the city and into the isolated wilderness was the vital key to their survival. Why does a change of scenery fail the individual, but succeed as an institution? Perhaps geography only changes a person when the new soil is intentionally, therapeutically cultivated for healing, rather than just being a place to run and hide.
A profound distinction. Fleeing your past is very different from deliberately stepping into a structured environment designed for your restoration.
Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into monitoring the moving of God, a history of America's Keswick. Keep exploring the history around you, keep asking the hard questions, and we'll see you next time.